Gamble cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are usually described as cards which have effects that are based somewhat on random chance, with most of them taking the form of performing a coin toss or rolling a 6-sided die, since these are two of the easiest extra materials that an average person should have access to pretty readily, and a vast majority of gamble cards rely on these two mechanics. Gamble cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are not very prevalent, and rarely do cards with gamble-like effects see competitive play. And why is that exactly? Let's take a look at another card game called Hearthstone, and more specifically a gamble card called Mind Control Tech. This is a pretty easy to summon minion which has the effect that if your opponent controls 4 or more minions, you can take control of one of them at random. Now, the effect of just stealing one of your opponent's minions is just as valuable in Hearthstone as it is in Yu-Gi-Oh! However, not being able to choose which one you take control of means the card can completely win you the game on its own by stealing a strong boss monster, or gain you a nominal amount of advantage by stealing a small token instead. And Mind Control Tech was so swingy in its nature that it actually was placed on their version of a ban list, for being too good of a gamble card. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Even has its own version of a gamble card that's too good in the form of 6 cents. This is a trap card which has the effect where you can declare 2 numbers from 1 to 6. Then your opponent gets to roll a 6-sided die. Based on the result of that roll, one of 2 things will happen. If the roll is equal to one of the numbers that you declared, you get to draw that many cards. If the roll is something else, you instead send that many cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard. So the best way to make use of 6 cents is to just declare the numbers 5 and 6. That way, if the roll is one of the higher numbers, you can draw 5 or 6 cards. And being able to draw 5 or 6 cards in the modern metagame is a huge advantage that can probably win you the game on its own. However, if you call the roll wrong, you also gain a beneficial effect, because sending cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard is useful in a lot of meta decks as well. So both of the gambling results of 6 cents are beneficial effects. It's just one of the effects can straight up win you the game on its own, while the other effect is just also good, but it's probably not going to win you the game. Mind Control Tech is the same way. If you're lucky, you can steal a very powerful monster your opponent controls and win the game. But if you're not, you still get a good effect. So if gamble effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Went along this vein of having super broken good effects on a positive result, or just normal good result on a negative result, then we probably would have a lot more gamble cards in the game that I've seen play. However, 6 cents is more of an exception rather than the rule. If we take a look at some of the more earlier gamble cards, stuff like Time Wizard, Graigumo, Graceful Dice, Skull Dice, or even Gamble, we have a wide variety of different types of gambling effects. In the case of Time Wizard, one of the most iconic gamble cards in the game, because it appeared heavily in the first anime, we have a low statted monster who has a simple heads or tails effect, where you get to call a coin toss, and if you call it correctly, you get to destroy all of your opponent's monsters, which is an excellent effect. However, if you call it incorrectly, you instead destroy all of your monsters, in addition to take damage equal to half the total attack of all the monsters that were destroyed on your side of the field. So Time Wizard falls into the category of good effect if you get it right, but terrible effect if you get it wrong. For gamble cards to be good, you need to also have a positive effect on that negative result, because you're still spending cards and losing card advantage to get the cards on the field. And if you spend a resource and don't actually advance the game state for doing so, then you just put yourself behind in card economy that can possibly lose you the duel right there. That's why having a singular card negate as part of your combos is so prevalent in the modern metagame strategies, where they're trying to put as many negates on the board as possible in order to out-card advantage your opponent through choice negates. So if the negative result not only does not give you any kind of positives, but is purely detrimental to you and can cause you to lose even more advantage, then it goes into the category of just not being worth using at all. It does fit more to the theme of gamble cards being, a gamble, but the gamble has to be so good that it can possibly win you the game in order to make up for that terrible downside. Time Wizard does have a good effect on its heads result, but itself requires your normal summon or using up a resource to cheat on the field. So if you waste your normal summon on Time Wizard and don't have any other extenders, your whole turn is basically summoning Time Wizard, hoping for a positive result, and you're rewarded with a 500 attack monster on the field that can't really do anything else. So its effect is just not really worth the risk. Even though the positive result is technically good, it's just not technically good enough. In the same vein, we also have Gamble, which is a trap card that has the condition where you can only activate this card if your opponent has 6 or more cards in their hand, and you have 2 or less cards in yours, where you get to toss a coin and call either heads or tails. And if you call it correctly, you get to draw until you have 5 cards in your hand. However, if you call it wrong, you skip your next turn. So, just like Time Wizard, it has an all or nothing gamble on a simple coin toss, where drawing 5 cards can possibly win you the game, or skipping your next turn will almost certainly lose you the game. And Gamble would be an excellent card if it wasn't for the activation requirement being really hard to set up. Unlike Time Wizard, trying to get a positive result on Gamble is actually worth putting resources into to an extent. It would be worth trying to get a heads result on Gamble. You might even play cards like Second Coin Toss in order to increase your chance to get a positive result from this card. But the game state required in order to even use the card, where your opponent needs to have more than 6 cards in their hand while you have almost none, just makes it too hard to activate, surprisingly enough, on top of the Gamble effect, maybe losing to the game if it doesn't resolve correctly. So it never saw any competitive play, but it was only half because of its actual Gamble effect. Then we have something like Graigumo, another early Gamble card whose effect is just being a high stat and level 4 monster with 2200 attack, which would allow it to beat over pretty much any other level 4 monster in the game at the time, as the highest attack, most played level 4 monster was Zombra the Dark, which only had 2100 attack baseline. So the Gamble effect on Graigumo was a little bit different to Time Wizard, in the fact that you always gain the benefits of the card no matter what, i.e. it being a 2200 attack level 4 monster. The gamble was whether or not you took a negative effect for declaring an attack, as whenever you attack with a card you'd have to call a coin toss, and if you called it wrong you would lose half your life points. However, the attack would still go through, so Graigumo was actually not half bad when it comes to a gamble card, because its system of design wasn't an all or nothing gamble, and more of a gamble to see if you would take any kind of negative effect or not, for always having its positive effect available. But its positives were just not good enough, where you'd want to risk the downside of paying half your life points, because early Yu-Gi-Oh cared a lot more about the life points than modern Yu-Gi-Oh does, so most decks didn't really take that risk. And then we have the Fairy Dice cards. Graceful Dice allows you to roll a 6-sided die in order to increase the attack and defense of all your monsters by the result times 100. And Skull Dice was the opposite. You roll a dice in order to lower the attack and defense of all of your opponent's monsters by the result times 100. So, no matter what your result on the die, you were going to gain the beneficial effect from both of these cards. The gamble was simply to see if it was a bigger effect or a smaller one. And the problem with these two cards was that no matter what you rolled, the stat increase or decrease was just incredibly minor, where it didn't really matter. If you always rolled 6 on the result, that's not really worth going -1 in card advantage for. So Graceful Dice and Skull Dice are in the camp of having a positive effect no matter what. It's just the positive effect in a best case scenario is not really worth running either of the cards for. So there's no risk to getting it a low result either, if the high result is not better than just running a normal staple. Another category of gamble cards are monsters which have a gamble effect in order to copy the effect of another card that does not have a gamble effect tied to it. If we take a look at a card like YuGiOh, it has the effect where if it's sent to the graveyard as a result of battle, you're able to toss a coin. And if you call it correctly, you get to destroy one monster on your opponent's side of the field. The main benefit of YuGiOh over something like Man-Eater Bug is probably that it has more stats. Specifically, its defensive stats at 1700. So it could be more useful in the field if it eventually goes to the graveyard, by maybe surviving a battle phase and blocking out one attack first. But even then, we have cards like Snowman Eater, which have even better defensive stats and gain the positive effect much easier by just being flipped face up. And there's lots of other categories that gamble cards fall into. Sometimes they're there to curtail a positive effect, like Sasuke Samurai No. 4 having the ability to destroy a monster at the start of the damage step, but only if you call a coin toss correctly. But going over every other category that gamble cards fall into would probably be listing half of the gamble cards. So this is just to give an example of some of the gamble cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! And gamble cards themselves only receive nominal support over the years, but never really a set that just had nothing but gamble support. Usually they just release random new gamble cards like Dice Foon or Blind Obliteration without really making a big deal of either of the gamble cards. But there have been a couple of archetypes of gamble-like mechanics inside of them. In 2003, they released the first wave of Archfiend cards, which were a series of fiend-type monsters that were based on chessboard pieces, and all shared an effect where they had targeted protection from effects, but only under a condition. Let's take a look at Shadow Knight Archfiend, for example. This is a 2000 attack level 4 monster, where it has a maintenance cost of 900 life points during each of your standby phases in order to keep it on the field. And if it's targeted by an opponent's card effect, you get to roll a 6-sided die. And if the result is exactly 3, you get to negate the effect and destroy that opponent's card. And also it halves any battle damage it deals to your opponent because it's a strong level 4 monster in 2003. And a lot of the early Archfiend cards were in this vein. Terror King Archfiend, the boss monster of the archetype, had an 800 life point maintenance cost, and if it was targeted by a card effect, you got to roll a 6-sided die. If the result was exactly 2 or 5, you got to negate the effect and destroy your opponent's card. Or if we take a look at the Summon Skull retrain, which is part of the Archfiend archetype, and was outfitted to have the same effects as them, it has a 500 life point maintenance cost during the standby phase, and if it's targeted by a card effect, you can negate the effect if you roll a 6-sided die and the result is 1, 3, or 6. So it has a 50% chance to negate targeted card effects. And they thought being able to sometimes negate a targeted effect was so good that these cards required a maintenance cost to be on the field, because obviously they were going to be broken if they could just be used like normal monsters. And the early Archfiends were terrible, and future iterations of Archfiends completely abandoned all of the mechanics of the early Archfiends, with only their Link monster paying homage to them, where it kind of does what they were trying to do, but better. It has a 500 maintenance cost during the standby phase, but also an effect where, if you pay life points, you can send a Fiend monster from your deck to the graveyard that has an attack or defense equal to the amount of life points you paid. And then it has a gamble effect where if a Fiend type monster is sent to the graveyard, you can roll a 6-sided die and then apply one of its 3 effects based on the result, where if the result is 1 exactly, you can add the card to your hand. If it's 2 to 5, it's shuffled back into the deck. Or if the result is 6 exactly, you get to special summon that card. So, the card only has a 1 1/3 chance of having a positive effect by rolling a 1 or 6. However, there is a trap card called That 6, which will always treat a dice roll as either 6 or 1. So it at least has some combo potential to always gain a positive result. So the first wave of Archfiend cards with their gamble-like protection was just not very good. Even though having targeted protection is very good, it's just gambling on whether or not you actually get to be target immune was not enough to make all the mediocre monsters with low attack and maintenance costs see very much competitive success. In 2008, they released another gamble archetype in the form of the Arcana Force cards. These cards all have the gamble effects, where when this card is summoned you get to toss a coin, and depending on the coin toss it would gain one of 2 effects, where the heads effect was almost always a positive effect and the tails effect was usually negative. However, the tails effect was usually super negative, like in the case of Arcana Force 7, the Chariot, where if you got the tails result on its effect, you had to give control of the card to your opponent. Not all of them were as bad as the Chariot, but they were pretty close. Arcana Force 3, the Empress, had a tails effect, where each time your opponent normal summons a monster, you would have to send a card from your hand to the graveyard. Where its positive effect was simply that if your opponent normal summons a monster, you were allowed to special summon an Arcana Force monster from your hand. Special summoning monsters from your hand is technically a good effect, but waiting for your opponent to normal summon a monster to do this is too slow for it to be worthwhile. Whereas having to discard each time your opponent normal summons a monster is much worse. The Arcana Force cards kind of failed horribly, just like the early Archfiends. A lot of them had technically good effects with their positive heads effects, and even had some ways of kind of forcing the heads effects with their field spell card Light Barrier, where it allowed you to choose the effect of the monster when it was summoned, but also required a coin toss each turn to see if you got to keep the effects or not. So the Arcana Force archetype did not see competitive play, even if a few of the cards in the archetype did see play, 3 of them to be exact. Arcana Force 0 the Fool, probably the most out of all of them. It has a gamble effect where, when this card is summoned, you get to toss a coin, and then the card will negate and destroy any card effect which targets the card, where if you got heads, it will negate your effects on the card, and if you get tails, it negates your opponent's effects on the card. So it's one of the few that has a positive tails effect rather than heads. However, this card was almost never summoned in a way where it would use its effect, as the reason this card saw play was because it had the effect where it can't be destroyed by battle. And battle immune monsters were kind of rare in 2008, where the few that did exist were actually limited on the ban list, so having an unlimited monster that was immune to battle destruction was pretty useful for some decks, especially if they needed a light or fairy type monsters. So Arcana Force 0 the Fool was not really used for its gamble effect at all, and just the other effect of the card. Same case for Arcana Force 14, Temperance, which was almost never used for its summon effect and instead for its hand effect, where you could discard this card from your hand in order to take no battle damage from a battle. In fact, Temperance sees a lot of play in Duel Links because of how valuable that effect is in that version of the game. The Arcana Force card that actually saw play for its gamble effect is Arcana Force 21, the World, where its heads effects has the effect that during your end phase, you can send 2 monsters you control to the graveyard to skip your opponent's next turn. And being able to skip your opponent's turn can kind of win you the game because of how powerful that effect is. So a Danger deck took Arcana Force the World to an event, used a super combo that allowed them to turbo the card out as well as search out Light Barrier to guarantee its head effect, and then skip their opponent's turn in order to beat them with the extra board setup. And none of these 3 Arcana Force cards were played together in any of the decks that used them in competitive play. And the only reason Arcana Force 21 The World was able to see competitive play, even if it was only a single time, was because there was a way to guarantee its gamble effect to have a positive result. A lot of gamble cards don't have these kinds of reassurances, especially some of the cards that are built purely for what I assume Konami thought would be a gamble deck. Let's take a look at the Sand Gambler, Gambler of Legend, and Dice Jar. The Sand Gambler is a level 3 monster with only 300 attack, which has the effect where you toss a coin 3 times, and if all 3 results are heads, you get to destroy all of your opponent's monsters. But if the result is 3 tails, you instead destroy all of your monsters. So it's like a harder to use Time Wizard. Even though it was supposed to be meant as a pure gambling card, it doesn't actually have a better effect than one Time Wizard is able to do for a much easier result that can be somewhat controlled with second coin toss, which actually made monsters who only toss a single coin for their effect a lot more valuable than ones who tossed multiple, since they also introduced a card called Lucky Chance, where once per turn if a monster activates a coin toss effect which only tosses 1 coin, you get to then toss a coin and call heads or tails in order to draw 1 card after the effect resolves. And it wasn't until way later that they added support for cards that tossed multiple coins, with Proton Blast. This card wasn't released until 2018, 14 years after Sand Gambler, and it has the effect that once per turn, if an effect is activated which tosses coins, you can resolve its effects based on the number of heads you get, where you can inflict 500 points of damage to your opponent with 1 heads result, destroy 1 card your opponent controls with 2, or look at your opponent's hand and discard 1 card from their hand if you get 3 or more. And you can accumulate all 3 of these effects with multiple coin tosses, but you can only try once per turn. And it even has a graveyard effect, where if you activate an effect which tosses 2 or more coins, you can banish this card from your graveyard in order to treat all of the results as heads. So Proton Blast would have been excellent support for Sand Gambler in the early days of the game. Although, even being able to guarantee 3 heads results would probably not allow Sand Gambler to see play today, because the effect is just not good enough for all of that setup. 3 years after Sand Gambler, in 2007, they released the Gambler of Legend, which is an upgraded version that has the effect where you can toss a coin 3 times, and then apply the appropriate effect based on the number of heads, where if you get 3 heads, you destroy all of your opponent's monsters, just like Sand Gambler. If you only get 2 heads, you get to discard 1 random card from your opponent's hand. If you get 1 head, you have to destroy 1 of your cards, and if you get 3 tails, you have to discard your entire hand. So Gambler of Legend is a vast improvement over the original, of being a pure gambling card, as it has 2 possible positive effects. And then there's Dice Jar, which requires both players to roll a 6-sided die, and the player with the lower result takes damage equal to the result times 500. However, if someone wins the result by rolling a 6, the loser takes 6,000 damage instead. And if the result on both dice is the same, you just re-roll until you get a different result. So, if we were to take the pure gambled themed cards that are meant to work outside of archetypes and stand on their own, and put them into a deck with a whole bunch of support to allow their effects to go off better, and you were lucky enough to get heads results on pretty much everything, your win condition would be to hope your opponent has no forms of disruptions to stop your plays, because they can't really push for game on their own, and they can't really deal enough damage to win unless you're able to resolve Dice Jar's effect twice with the 6 roll. Part of the problem with gamble cards is that pure gamble cards just do such a bad job of being staples that they can't really be played in a normal deck in order to complement their plays. And they simultaneously don't fit in their own decks of just gamble effects either. So the only way gamble cards have been able to see competitive play is if they fit into a distinction of being a good staple that happens to interact well with an archetype, if you're able to make use of the negative side effects, or if it's part of an archetype which allows you to circumvent a lot of its effects. And there have been some other cards that fit into all of those other categories. And in the part 2 version of this video, we'll be going over the few gamble cards that actually saw competitive play, or actually contributed to their archetype while having a gamble-like effect. And you'll be surprised to know that there was a gamble card that was actually used as a staple for 5 years and never once appeared on a ban list.